I've always believed that loyalty and trust were the cornerstones of any good relationship. My life had always seemed to have a clear direction, whether it was during my time in the U.S. Navy or when I got married. I thought I had brought the same discipline and order into my home life. I met Alice when we were young, and while things between us weren't perfect, I thought we had built something strong. Sure, we faced our share of challenges, but nothing could have prepared me for the betrayal that was coming. We had two amazing daughters, Emily and Grace, and a house that I thought of as our sanctuary. I worked hard to be a good husband and father, but deep down, I always felt like there was something I wasn't seeing. Still, nothing could have prepared me for what I found one evening. The discovery that would change everything. It all started with that one video. I had no idea the storm it was about to unleash on my life. Alice and I got married when I was 28, hopeful and full of dreams. By that time, we had already been together for 7 years, and our daughters were still very young. Alice always seemed like the perfect wife, and I thought we were both happy with our lives. But everything shattered when I accidentally stumbled on a video of her on a website called Hidden Fantasies. The moment I saw it, I felt like my entire world had been turned upside down. I remember that sinking feeling as I inserted the DVD into the player. I froze when Alice's face appeared on the screen. She looked a little younger, but it was clearly her. I grabbed our old photo albums and began comparing images. After searching through the memories, I found the match. Same hair, same makeup, same face from just around the time of our honeymoon. That's when it hit me. She made that video when we were newly married. I was in shock, but years of training told me to act quickly. I knew I had to stay calm and take control of the situation. In the military, they teach you that attack is often the best form of defense, and I knew I couldn't afford to let things spiral. The house was in my name, and we didn't share bank accounts. I knew I had a strong chance of getting custody of the girls, especially with the proof I had. Without hesitation, I grabbed a bunch of black trash bags and started packing up Alice's belongings. When I was done, the garage was full of her things. All I had to do was wait for her to come home. That evening, Alice, who worked as a legal secretary, arrived home late. She apologized and mentioned she'd taken the kids to her parents' house for the night so we could enjoy some time together. I gave her a short, emotionless reply as she headed upstairs to take a shower. My mind was focused on the next steps. I quietly removed her house keys from the keyring and waited in the kitchen. A few minutes later, she came down in a towel, looking confused. "Where are my clothes?" she asked, bewildered. "They're in the garage," I replied, my voice cold. "And you need to leave." She stared at me, shocked and trying to process what I had just said. She stammered out some excuses, tried to deny everything, but it was too late for that. I was done listening. She started crying, but I made it clear that she needed to go. When she refused, I grabbed her arm and moved her toward the door. She struggled, and in the heat of the moment, I yanked her up by the hair. Her towel fell to the floor, but I was too furious to care. When we reached the front door, I realized I was holding a clump of her hair in my hand. I opened the door and tossed her outside onto the lawn. She landed awkwardly in the bushes, naked and sobbing. I went back inside, grabbed her car keys and the DVD, and then stepped out onto the porch. She sat there, crying. "Why, Jack? Why are you doing this?" she whimpered. Without answering, I threw her car keys at her, and then the DVD. "That's why," I said. "And there's more where that came from." The DVD hit her face, leaving a small cut on her cheek. I slammed the door shut and watched through the window as she sat there, covering herself. Mrs. Patterson, the neighborhood busybody, quickly ran over and helped her with a coat. I wasn't surprised. Of course, she would come to Alice's aid. After a few minutes, Alice found some clothes in the garage, got into her car, and drove away. I spent the rest of the night finishing up packing, then headed to a bar and drank until closing time. I stumbled home, still angry and exhausted, and collapsed into bed. The next morning, I woke up with a splitting headache and heard loud knocking on the front door. "All your stuff's in the garage," I shouted, still groggy. "Mr. Carter, this is the police." "Open the door," a voice called out. My heart sank. I opened the door to find 2 officers standing on the porch. "Mr. Jack Carter?" one of them asked. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, confused. You're under arrest for assault and causing actual bodily harm, the officer said flatly. I was stunned. Who did I assault? I asked, completely bewildered. You're being charged with attacking Mrs. Alice Carter, he replied. I was in complete disbelief. All I did was throw her out of the house after finding out she made an adult film, I protested. What's wrong with that? The officer gave me a stern look. That's not for me to decide. Please come with us. I got dressed and went with them, my head spinning as my neighbors watched me get into the back of the police car. At the station, they showed me pictures of Alice's injuries, bruises, scratches, the cut on her cheek, and a clump of missing hair. It was hard to look at, knowing I had done that to her. I tried explaining everything again, but the detective just said, that's for the court to decide. They let me out on bail, but by then, the damage was done. Neighbors had already spoken to the police, including Mrs. Patterson. When I got home, Alice's things were gone. I waited to hear from her or her parents, but the weekend passed in silence. On Monday, the case was referred to the county court, and I had to surrender my passport. By Tuesday, I was working on my divorce. I gave my lawyer the video and a photo from our honeymoon, hoping that would help. He seemed confident that I would get custody of the kids and the house. But by Wednesday, a letter arrived from Alice's lawyer. She was filing for divorce, claiming cruelty, and had a restraining order filed against me, barring me from coming within 200 yards of her, her parents, or our children. I couldn't believe it. After everything, she was the one divorcing me, and somehow, I was the one at fault? As soon as I left the courthouse, I called my attorney. Our next meeting wasn't nearly as reassuring as the first one. He was frustrated that I hadn't given him the full picture earlier. Alice's accusations of cruelty, combined with the assault charge, were making everything more complicated than it needed to be. If I was convicted, I could lose the house, be forced to pay child support, and potentially even lose custody of the girls. My lawyer advised me to switch our divorce petition to irreconcilable differences to avoid a drawn-out court battle, but I refused. She had cheated on me with multiple men, and I wasn't about to let that slide. So, we stayed with the original filing, knowing it was going to be an ugly fight. As I left his office, the confidence I once had was starting to fade. It dawned on me that I was in over my head financially. Alice had always handled the bills, and now I needed someone to help me out. After some searching, I hired Sarah, a sharp, no-nonsense accountant who was recently divorced herself. She took over managing my finances and warned me that I was about to find out how much Alice had actually been doing behind the scenes. And sure enough, her words soon came back to haunt me. Over the next few weeks, my anger from that night faded, replaced by a deep loneliness. I missed Alice, but more than that, I missed my daughters. The house felt empty. I stopped cooking for myself, opting instead to eat at the bar most nights, where I drank more than I should have. Work started slipping through the cracks, and before long, I found myself drowning in letters about overdue bills. Alice had canceled all the automatic payments, and I was behind by hundreds, with no clue how to catch up. Even the $1,000 I was depositing for household expenses was nowhere near enough to cover everything. When I told Sarah, she just smirked and said, "Welcome to reality." A month later, I received a court date for the divorce hearing, but still hadn't heard anything from Alice or her lawyer. Meanwhile, I was anxiously waiting for a trial date on the assault charge. I cut back on the nights at the bar, but I wasn't taking care of myself. My weekly visits to Sarah to go over the paperwork became a small comfort. We got along well, but she didn't share my bitterness about the divorce. "At least after the hearing, you'll know where you stand," she'd say. When the court day finally came, I showed up in my best suit, determined to present my case. Alice was there too, but she wouldn't even look at me. My attorney argued that Alice's behavior, her involvement in that adult video, made her unfit to raise our girls, and he pushed for me to get full custody. Alice, on the other hand, flat out denied everything, insisting she had never been unfaithful. I couldn't take it anymore. I interrupted the proceedings, demanding that the judge watch the video I had brought. When the judge finally saw it, he agreed that the woman in the video looked exactly like Alice. But then Alice dropped a bombshell that I never saw coming. She revealed that she had a twin sister, someone I had never met or even heard about. Her sister, Nicole, took the stand and confessed that she was the one in the video. She explained that she had lived a very different life from Alice, full of poor decisions and addictions, but with Alice's help, she had turned things around. I was floored. The judge noted the striking resemblance between the two women, but Nicole showed a tattoo on her ankle, proving that she was the one in the video. My attorney made one last attempt to salvage our case, but it was hopeless. The judge dismissed my petition. During the recess, I found myself apologizing to Alice. "You didn't even wait to find out the truth, did you?" she said quietly, before walking away. That afternoon, Alice moved forward with her own divorce petition. I didn't even bother fighting it. I knew I had already lost. The judge granted her custody of the girls and awarded her the house until they turned 18. We were to split our assets, and I was ordered to pay child support, a sum that far exceeded what I could manage. As if that wasn't enough, my time with the girls was to be arranged through social services. I left the courthouse feeling completely defeated. When I got home, I found a letter waiting for me with my trial date for the assault charge. Desperate to talk to someone, I called Sarah. Over a couple of bottles of wine, I laid everything out. She was shocked by what I had done. "You really thought that was the best thing to do?" she asked, staring at me in disbelief. "I don't know what I was thinking," I admitted. She practically pushed me to throw her out. I lost control. "Do you still love her?" Sarah asked, her voice softening. "I don't even know anymore. I just feel like I've ruined everything," I said, my voice thick with regret. We talked late into the night, and when I was about to leave, Sarah insisted I stay. "I'm not letting you drive after all this," she said. So, I stayed, unsure if it would complicate things between us. The next morning, I asked Sarah if she could handle my business if I ended up going to jail. She agreed, although she hoped it wouldn't come to that. 2 weeks later, I pled guilty in court. In the middle of my lawyer's defense, I cut him off, standing up to confess that the woman in the video wasn't Alice and that I had lost control. I apologized deeply, asking the court for leniency. When Alice took the stand, she shocked me again. She acknowledged the good man I used to be and explained that I had no idea about her sister. She even requested leniency on my behalf, saying our children still needed their father. I was overwhelmed with emotion. The judge took everything into account, my military service, my remorse, and Alice's request, and sentenced me to 6 months, but suspended the sentence for 2 years. As long as I stayed out of trouble, I wouldn't have to serve time. After the hearing, I thanked Alice, admitting I didn't deserve her mercy. She looked at me with a sadness in her eyes and said, "I don't hate you, Jack. I hate what you did. You need to get help." Back at work, my staff welcomed me with open arms, and I felt a little lighter. That night, Sarah reviewed my finances again. She revealed a hard truth. My business had been losing money for a while, and Alice had been secretly covering the shortfall, making me realize I wasn't the provider I thought I was. "You lost a good woman," Sarah said bluntly, and I couldn't help but agree. We talked about ways to save the business, realizing I'd need to either cut costs or somehow increase revenue, though the latter would take time. Sarah offered me a room at her place as a temporary lodger, making light-hearted jokes about it. Though I stayed with her that night, my mind was on Alice. The following week, I moved out of the house for good, dropping off the keys at her parents' place. Social services limited my time with Emily and Grace to just 2 supervised hours a week. On top of everything, the child support payments were crushing me, far beyond what I was able to afford. It felt like my entire life was unraveling. I had wrongfully accused Alice, ended up divorced, had a criminal record, and came to realize that my business had only survived thanks to her financial support. Determined to move forward, I knew I had to make some tough decisions. I needed to cut about $1,000 in expenses, and that meant letting one of my workers go. Instead of firing Tom, I offered him a part-time position along with some paid training for college, hoping to keep things amicable. He agreed to the deal, and it felt like a small victory. I also reached out to social services to arrange my supervised visits with the girls. The process was slow and honestly humiliating, but I stayed calm, knowing this was my only path forward. During one visit, the social worker even offered to help me find programs to manage my temper, something Alice had suggested before. When I finally saw Emily and Grace, Emily ran into my arms, but Grace was more hesitant. It broke my heart to see her so unsure of me. The structured environment felt stifling, and it was clear these visits were just as difficult for the girls as they were for me. Emily asked tough questions, and though the first hour went by quickly, the second hour dragged as the girls got bored. At the end of the visit, Janice, the social worker, smiled at me. "I found a program for veterans struggling with civilian life," she said. She set me up with an appointment on Friday, and I joked that I was grateful for her help. That night, I told Sarah about the visit, and she laughed, saying, "You're already fixing the things they'd have flagged at your case conference. You'll be ahead of the game." I shook my head and admitted, "That's not why I'm doing this. I can't believe what I did to Alice. It scares me that I'm capable of hurting someone like that." Sarah, usually blunt and unshaken, seemed surprised when I opened up about the violence. When I went to my first session that Friday, I met with John, a former soldier who had seen combat in the Falklands and the Gulf War. He explained how many veterans end up in prison for violent offenses and that his program was designed to help us avoid that path. He listened as I explained what had led to my trial, the video, and throwing Alice out. He asked me a pointed question: "Do you really feel sorry for her?" I hesitated, then admitted that I hadn't. He dug deeper, showing me how my emotions were tangled up in contradictions. I realized I had hated Alice in that moment, the same way I had hated enemies in battle. John explained that I had connected anger with hatred, something that served me well in war, but was dangerous in regular life. His goal was to help me break that link and find a healthier way to deal with my emotions. When I left John's office, I felt more drained than I ever had on any mission in Afghanistan. Back at Sarah's place, she noticed right away. "What happened to you? You look terrible," she said. I couldn't face more questions, so I headed to my room to try and clear my head. Over the next few weeks, therapy sessions became a bit easier, and my visits with the girls improved. I started bringing coloring books and other small activities to keep them entertained, and our time together felt less strained. Eventually, my relationship with Janice grew more relaxed. After about 6 weeks, she smiled and said, "Good news. Supervision is no longer required. You and Alice can now arrange visits on your own." I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. I thanked her and made a joke about making sure her husband knew how lucky he was. The news lifted my spirits, and soon, Alice and I agreed that I'd have the girls every other Sunday, with the goal of extending that to weekends once I had a suitable place for them to stay. On the first unsupervised visit, Alice was surprisingly friendly. We sat down for coffee, and she mentioned that she had met someone named Eric. She had also heard about the changes I'd been making at work. I admitted that I had discovered she'd been helping keep the business afloat by quietly covering my financial shortfalls. Without her, and with the added pressure of child support, I was forced to make difficult decisions. Alice apologized for not telling me about the extra money, explaining she had just been trying to help without hurting my pride. We discussed child support, and she reminded me that she wasn't the one directly receiving the money. She even suggested that we appeal to lower the amount. During the visit, I couldn't help but notice that our wedding photo was still in its usual spot, and Alice was still wearing her rings. A few days later, my lawyer called. Alice was offering to give up her share of my business in exchange for my share of the house. At first, I was shocked, but after some thought, I agreed to the deal. Without the burden of the mortgage, I could manage better financially. When I tried to discuss it with Alice, she simply said, "It was never my intention to punish you, Jack. You're still the father of my children." Over time, our relationship improved, and she even started asking me to pick up the girls from daycare now and then. But when the decree absolute came through, officially ending our marriage, it hit me harder than I expected. Sarah tried to cheer me up by taking me out to dinner, but instead, it made things worse. She seemed to act like we were more than just friends, introducing me as her partner to others. Even on nights when I slept alone, I would wake up to Sarah offering more than just a friendly morning greeting. One evening, I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. "Sarah," I said carefully, "we're still just friends, right?" I looked at Sarah, feeling the tension in the air as I asked, "We're still just friends, right?" She seemed embarrassed, almost caught off guard. "I was hoping we were becoming something more," she admitted quietly. I sighed and explained that while I cared for her deeply as a friend, I couldn't be the man she was hoping for. My feelings for Alice hadn't faded, and I couldn't commit to anything new. If Alice asked me to come back, I told her, I'd be gone in a heartbeat. I just don't want to hurt you. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and I held her as she cried. After a while, I gently told her that I needed to move out. She agreed, though I could see it hurt her. Within a week, I found a small apartment above a local takeout place. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it gave me the space I needed to focus on my next steps. I decided to sell my prized Morgan sports car for some capital, which surprised Eric, who never thought I'd part with it. Even Alice was shocked when she found out. "You sold the Morgan?" she asked one afternoon. "You also sent back the divorce settlement money. Do you hate me that much?" I assured her that it wasn't about hate. "I don't want to profit from my mistakes," I explained. "The money's for the business. I need to build it back up on my own." Over time, my new business venture, a roadside tire service for trucks, started to take off. Things were improving financially, but I still felt a deep sense of loneliness. Sarah and I maintained our friendship, but emotionally, I was still tied to Alice, even though she didn't seem interested in rekindling anything between us. As the holidays approached, Sarah invited me to spend Christmas Day with her. I accepted, thinking it would be easier than spending the day alone. Later, Alice invited me to join her and the girls for Christmas, which stung. It felt like the invitation was more for the girls than for me. I declined, suggesting I come by on Boxing Day instead. Alice didn't take it well. She called me at work, clearly upset, and asked, "Why would you choose to spend Christmas with Sarah over your kids?" I tried to explain that Sarah had asked me first, and she didn't have anyone else to spend the holiday with. After a long pause, Alice finally calmed down and surprised me by inviting Sarah to join us on Boxing Day. Christmas went better than expected. Alice was cordial, and even told me that she liked Sarah. As we left, Sarah said something that stuck with me. "It's obvious Alice still loves you. Everyone can see it, except you two." Sarah was determined to help get Alice and me back together, but neither of us realized there were other forces at play. After the new year, Alice and I seemed to be growing closer again. We shared more conversations and laughs, but once she returned to work, we drifted back into just being polite co-parents, leaving me confused. On the other hand, my business continued to thrive. I had been leading group therapy sessions for veterans in Aldershot for a few months when John, my therapist, told me I no longer needed to attend. He said I had made significant progress, which made me feel proud. Life continued to improve, and 2 years after the divorce, I made a major business move by purchasing a car dealership for $300,000. With Sarah's help, I secured a loan, and soon J&G Auto Services was thriving. Tom had completed his college course, and I offered him the chance to be his own boss by renting a bay in the new workshop. He jumped at the opportunity, and within a year, all the service bays were full, and we were making more money than ever. Not long after expanding the business, I met Kelly, a charismatic blonde who worked for an auto supply company. She flirted with me, joking that her colleagues had nicknamed me the Iceman because I didn't respond to their usual tactics. We hit it off, and I asked her out on a date. The evening went well, but Kelly made it clear she was looking for more than casual dinners. The following week, she invited herself over to my place, and things quickly turned physical. I wasn't expecting her bluntness, but we ended up in bed. Although it was passionate, I wasn't sure how I felt about it afterward. Despite my uncertainty, life was moving forward. The business was booming, and I was exploring new romantic possibilities. But deep down, something still felt incomplete. Alice and I remained distant, and Sarah, always supportive, kept encouraging me to try to find a way back to Alice. One evening, Kelly stopped by unexpectedly, wanting to plan another date. I decided to slow things down and planned a simple dinner and movie, hoping to get to know her better. Over dinner, I shared more of my story, but getting Kelly to open up was like pulling teeth. I figured I'd give her time to warm up and share things at her own pace. That Sunday, when I picked up Emily and Grace, Alice made us coffee and asked about Kelly. There was a hint of jealousy in her voice. "I'm happy for you," she said. "You need a woman in your life." "I do," I replied, "but I need a certain kind of woman, one who still loves me but won't let me back in." Alice repeated what she'd said before. She couldn't trust me or feel safe with me again. I reminded her that both social services and my therapist had cleared me, but she remained firm. Still, she didn't deny that she loved me, which confirmed what Sarah had been saying all along. Meanwhile, my relationship with Kelly became more physical, but something still felt off. Her secrecy started to bother me. One night, as she was leaving, I asked, "Are you ashamed of me?" "Of course not," she replied, but I couldn't shake the feeling she was hiding something. A few days later, after another night together, Kelly's handbag accidentally fell off the table. When I picked it up, 2 gold rings spilled out, one with a diamond. My suspicions flared up immediately. I slipped the rings into my pocket, waiting to see if she'd mention them. 5 minutes after leaving, Kelly rushed back, saying she had forgotten something in my bedroom. She searched frantically, but then claimed she had lost her phone. I dialed her number, and sure enough, the phone rang from inside her bag. "Were you really looking for this?" I asked, showing her the rings. Kelly exploded, accusing me of invading her privacy. I pointed out Kelly's lies and asked her to sit down. Eventually, she broke down and confessed. She wasn't divorced. She was still living with her husband, who worked night shifts, and staying at her mother's house. Kelly had been sneaking out while her husband was at work, and her mother believed she was just out with friends. I pressed her, asking why she had come after me. Was it the challenge of cracking the Iceman? Or were you hoping to trade up for someone with more money? She had no answer, and the whole situation left me feeling angry and disappointed. Tears rolled down Kelly's face as she admitted the truth. "I guess it was all of the above," she said. "The other delivery girls kept talking about how handsome you were, and I wanted to see for myself. They said you never responded to their flirting, so they started calling you the Iceman. I just wanted to thaw you out." She went on to explain that she thought I might be lonely and would appreciate the attention. But once we started sleeping together, she began to develop real feelings for me. "Fall for me?" I replied, shaking my head. "We were just using each other for sex. There was no love in it. It was enjoyable, sure, but it wasn't real." "So why did you keep going?" she asked, her voice soft. "I liked you, and yes, I was lonely. But if I'd known you were married, I never would have started anything." She offered to get a divorce, but I made it clear that it was her decision, not mine. "I don't want to be the reason for another broken marriage," I told her, asking her to leave and letting her know I didn't want to see her again, whether at work or anywhere else. As she left, Kelly apologized, giving me a tender kiss on the way out. "That's how you start making love," I muttered to myself after the door closed behind her. The next day, a new delivery driver, Trisha, showed up at work. I didn't bother explaining the situation to Mason or anyone else. A week later, when I went to pick up Emily and Grace, Alice invited me in for coffee. Cautiously, she asked how things were going with Kelly, and I told her the relationship had ended because Kelly was married. Alice seemed genuinely concerned, and we talked about how I'd handled the situation calmly. She was surprised when I mentioned that I'd been through therapy to help me control my anger. Despite the ups and downs, my life was gradually getting back on track. Business was booming, and I had saved enough to buy a house so the girls could stay over more often. However, things with Alice remained complicated. Every time we seemed to get close again, something would pull us back to square one. 4 years after our divorce, I had fully turned my life around. My business was thriving, and Sarah suggested I consult with a tax expert. One afternoon, while picking up some tires for the shop, I spotted a sleek Aston Martin DB5 parked outside. Mason noticed it too and muttered something about the driver being an arrogant jerk, which caught me off guard. Mason usually wasn't one to speak harshly about customers, so it made me curious. I got up to leave, but before I could, I noticed Mason had locked the door. I watched as he walked out to the parking lot, where a slim man with blonde hair, about 5 feet 10 inches, stepped out of the passenger side. He leaned into the car and kissed the driver, and that's when it hit me. The driver was Alice. I sat down, my head in my hands, overwhelmed by the sight of her kissing another man at my own shop. I had known this day would come, but actually seeing it was too much to bear. Tears filled my eyes. About half an hour later, Mason came back and handed me the receipt. "Sorry, boss. I was hoping you wouldn't be here when he showed up." "It's fine, Mason," I said, trying to steady my voice. "It was bound to happen eventually." No, it wasn't, he replied firmly. Not with a jerk like him. I changed the subject, asking Mason why we were charging $500 for 2 Pirelli tires. He explained that the guy had been bragging about sleeping with his girlfriend, who, as it turned out, was Alice. So I added $100 just for him being a jerk, Mason said with a smirk. That weekend, when I picked up the girls, I didn't mention seeing Alice with her new guy. As I walked into the house, I noticed our wedding photo had been taken down. Where's the picture? I asked casually. Oh, I must have put it away while I was cleaning, she replied, avoiding eye contact. I also noticed she wasn't wearing her rings anymore. I see you're not wearing your rings, I remarked. Well, I haven't been married for 4 years, she said softly. Then, she turned away and gathered the girls. They had been talking about Uncle Mill, and I couldn't help but wonder if that was the man I saw at the shop. As my 40th birthday approached, I decided I needed a pick-me-up, so I splurged on an extravagant gift for myself. When I arrived at work on my birthday, I was greeted by banners, cheeky birthday cards, and promises of a heavy night of drinking from Mason and Tom. They had planned everything. That evening, we hit the pub, where my favorite beer was on tap, and the regulars were in full attendance, bringing plenty of laughs. Around 8:30, 2 police officers walked in, calling out my name. My heart sank, thinking something terrible had happened, but it turned out to be part of the surprise. One of the officers handed me a mock ticket for driving with no insurance, and then the other proceeded to give a hilarious striptease. She ended the act by slipping her number into my pocket before walking out with a grin. Later, Mason announced we were heading to the Star of India for dinner, where the wives and girlfriends were already waiting. As everyone paired off, I started to feel strangely alone, until Sarah walked in, looking stunning. Mason leaned over and mentioned that he had tried to invite Alice, but she was too busy with her new guy. Sarah sat beside me, gently touching my hand. Isn't it nice to be surrounded by people who love you? She said with a warm smile. We ordered our food, and despite all the fun, I couldn't help but feel like something was still missing. I couldn't help but feel the sting of disappointment. Neither Alice nor the girls had sent me a birthday card. Sensing my mood, Sarah leaned over and whispered, You're not going home alone tonight. Come over to mine. I've got something special for you. I forced a smile, but said, It's not sex I need. She grinned playfully and replied, Well, we can do that too, if you like. The party wrapped up around 11 o'clock, and since Sarah had stuck to orange juice all night, she drove me back to her place. Once we got there, she handed me an envelope and a gift. The card made me laugh, as expected, but the gift caught me off guard. It was a collection of vinyl records from blues legends, John Lee Hooker, Howlin' Wolf, Elmore James, and Sonny Boy Williamson. I was touched, knowing how hard it must have been to find them. Sarah kissed me gently and whispered, Let's make this night even more memorable. The next morning, we swung by my place so I could grab fresh clothes and check the mail. I hoped for birthday cards from Emily and Grace, but there were none. Back at work, I endured the usual ribbing about turning 40, like finding a walker next to my desk instead of my chair. After sorting through some paperwork, I headed to the shop floor to thank Mason. Who do I thank for last night's celebration? I asked. All Mason's idea, Tom replied with a grin. He organized the whole thing, even the dancer. I think she had a bit of a crush on you, by the way. On Sunday, I picked up the girls in the new car I had bought myself for my birthday. When we pulled up at Alice's, Emily asked excitedly, Mom, have you seen Dad's new car? Alice looked surprised and asked, What brought that up? It was a birthday present to myself, I said. Emily's mood shifted suddenly, and she turned to Alice, her voice angry. I told you we had to get something for Dad's birthday, but you made us go with Miles instead. I hate him and I hate you. She clung to me while Alice's eyes filled with tears. I reassured Alice that Emily didn't mean it. She was just upset about missing my birthday. Alice apologized, saying she hadn't realized it had been my birthday, and I reminded her that Mason had left messages, which she must have overlooked. After a fun day out at the river with the girls, we returned, but Emily stormed inside without even glancing at Alice. I pulled Alice aside and said, She doesn't hate you. She's just upset and feels like you're putting Miles before everything else. Tears welled up in Alice's eyes as she admitted she had hurt me by forgetting my birthday. I never meant to use the girls against you, she said quietly. I know, but I think Miles might have, I replied. I mentioned how Mason had overcharged Miles for tires as a sort of birthday gift, and sarcastically thanked Miles for contributing to my party. Alice's tears flowed, but I knew this wasn't something I could fix. It was clear that Miles was creating a wedge between us, and any hope of reconciliation seemed to be slipping away. A few days later, I received a package in the mail, a pilot's chronometer engraved with, "To Jack on his 40th birthday," from Alice, Emily, and Grace. I called Alice to thank her, and she proudly told me she had picked it out herself. Though I suspected Miles had influenced the choice, I told her, if it wasn't engraved, I'd return it. What I really wanted was for the girls to choose something for me. Alice went quiet, then responded, I was trying to make things right. No, you were trying to spend money to make yourself feel better. If you really want to fix things, take the girls shopping next time, I said. Her silence turned to anger. I have a right to my own life, she snapped. You do, I agreed. But if your responsibilities to the kids are getting in the way, maybe it's time to think about letting me take over. Alice hung up abruptly. I sighed, thinking, well, that didn't go well at all. The next time I picked up the girls, Alice barely spoke to me. I placed the box with the watch on the kitchen counter. You just need to replace the back, I said. You couldn't just accept my apology and the gesture, could you? She asked, frustration in her voice. I don't think a $400 watch is just a gesture, I replied. Let's just move on. As we left, Emily shot her mother a cold glare. Our relationship remained strained, so I was taken aback when Alice called and suggested we have dinner at Gino's, a cozy little Italian place, on Friday night. I had mixed feelings. Alice hadn't shown any interest in dating me since the divorce, so I suspected that things weren't going well with Miles. Maybe she needed some comfort. I made sure to dress well, a suit, tie, fresh haircut. When Alice arrived, she took my breath away in a stunning black dress. You look amazing, I said, unable to hide my admiration. Thank you. You're looking pretty good yourself, she replied with a smile. We had a pleasant dinner, talking about the girls and work, carefully avoiding any discussion about us. But after dessert, I decided it was time to address the elephant in the room. Taking her hands, I said, I've been hoping for a second chance for a long time. Alice pulled her hands away, her expression changing. Jack, I didn't ask you here to talk about us getting back together. In fact, it's the opposite. I'm getting married to Miles, once his divorce is finalized. I was stunned, but I tried to stay composed. What do you need from me? I asked quietly. There is something, she admitted. Miles's family wants the girls to take his last name. I was floored. Wait, are you asking me to let him adopt my children? How long have you even known this guy? I've known Miles for about 6 years, she explained. He's a barrister and works at my firm. Suddenly, everything clicked. He had probably been influencing Alice throughout our entire divorce, undermining any chance of us getting back together. So, he's the reason you never gave me a second chance? I asked, my voice tight with anger. Not exactly, she said defensively. Miles gave me advice, yes, but calling him a poison pusher isn't fair. Okay, I said, trying to refocus. Let's get back to why we're here. You're asking me to let a man my daughters barely tolerate adopt them? You're making this harder than it needs to be, she replied, exasperated. I thought you'd be happy to stop paying the $300 a week to child support. I held back my anger and took a deep breath. Alice, I've changed, but I'm not the kind of man who would sell his children, I said, keeping my voice calm. I didn't mean it like that, she quickly responded. I was just pointing out the benefits. I pressed on. Tell me, how exactly does this benefit the girls? She had no answer, which didn't surprise me. Right, so this only benefits you and Miles. Why should I agree to it? After a pause, she said, Miles can't have children. If he marries me without the girls taking his name, his family will cut him off. I knew something wasn't right. It felt like Miles was manipulating the situation, probably counting on me to refuse so he could shift the blame. I don't think much of a man who puts money and inheritance over love, I said flatly. but I'll consider it under two conditions. My access to the girls stays the same, guaranteed in writing, and I won't sign anything until you two are married. I won't give him any control over my daughters unless you're there to protect them." Alice was so wrapped up in the conversation that she didn't even notice the Aston Martin pulling up outside. Miles had made it halfway into the restaurant before she realized he was there. "Hey, babe," he said, glancing at her, then at me. "Are we done here?" He took one look at her teary eyes and jumped to conclusions. "I told you he wouldn't go for it. When has he ever cared about your happiness?" he sneered. "I think you've misunderstood," I interjected. I agreed, but with a couple of conditions. I laid out my terms, but Miles wasn't impressed. "That doesn't really change much," he complained. "It gives you what you want. My daughters can take your name, but I won't give up my rights as their father," I explained. "That's unacceptable," he snapped, growing frustrated. I added, "I won't sign anything until you're married. So, yes, you'll have to trust me." "You could back out after we're already married," Miles said, clearly annoyed. "You're making it sound like you don't actually want to marry her," I said, gesturing toward Alice. Alice, busy checking her makeup in a compact mirror, excused herself to the restroom. The moment she was gone, Miles kept trying to rile me up, but I stayed calm. When Alice returned, I stood up, shook Miles's hand firmly, and leaned in close. "If you ever hurt her or my kids, I'll break your neck." "That's a promise," I whispered. He went pale as I prepared to leave. Alice kissed me softly on the lips. "Thank you, Jack. I can see you've really changed," she said quietly. The next Saturday, I received a panicked call from Emily. "Daddy, come quick. Mommy's not waking up." "I can't get her up," she cried. I rushed over and found Alice unconscious in bed, a half-empty bottle of liquor on the nightstand and some missing pills. I grabbed the pill bottle, picked Alice up, and told Emily to get Grace. We all piled into the car, and I sped toward the hospital. About a mile in, a police car pulled me over. Fortunately, the officer, PC John, an old army buddy of mine, recognized me. "Follow me. I'll get you there," he said, offering an escort. Once we arrived at the hospital, I handed the pills to a nurse, and they led us to a waiting room. John and his partner, WPC Nicola Bates, joined us soon after. John asked, "Who's the woman?" "She's my ex-wife, Alice," I explained. Nicola, who had already started taking notes, asked, "Isn't she the one you were charged with attacking a few years ago?" "Yes, but this has nothing to do with that," I said, trying to stay calm. "I regret what happened back then. Today's situation is different." "What exactly happened today?" Nicola asked. Emily quickly spoke up. "I called Daddy because Mommy wouldn't wake up. I explained about the alcohol and pills and how I'd driven Alice to the hospital myself." Nicola seemed surprised. "You didn't call an ambulance?" she asked. "I thought I could get her here quicker," I replied. John stepped in. "We're just doing our job, Jack. Don't worry." Nicola seemed satisfied, putting her notebook away and giving Emily a kind smile. "You've got a good dad here," she said. John added, "We're off duty in an hour. I'll check in later to see how things are going." After they left, I did my best to reassure Grace and Emily that their mom would be okay. It felt like we waited forever, but after about 30 minutes, a nurse came over and said Alice was responding to treatment. An hour later, I was allowed to see her. She looked rough, her hair matted, and in 4 drip in her arm. She muttered an apology. "I'm sorry. I ruined your weekend and scared the girls," she said, her voice hoarse. "Why, Alice?" I asked gently. "What were you trying to escape?" She whispered, "I just wanted to block everything out. I needed to stop thinking." "Thinking about what? What could be so bad that you needed alcohol and pills to block it out?" I asked, confused. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I've been such a fool, Jack. He never wanted to marry me. He was just using me." She broke down, sobbing. A nurse stepped in and suggested I let her rest. Back in the waiting room, John and Nicola were keeping the girls entertained. Nicola, now dressed in casual clothes, looked stunning, but I barely registered it. The girls were relieved when I told them their mom would be okay, but we'd need to wait before taking her home. John leaned over and said, "You could use this as evidence if you want to contest custody, you know?" I don't want that, I replied quietly, watching the girls. I'm not trying to take anything away from Alice, I replied. The girls need stability, and Alice has always been a good mom. She just needs some help right now, and I'm here for her. Nicola added, some people at the station paint you as a bad guy, but John says you're a good man. I'm starting to think he's right. After a bit more conversation, John left, but Nicola stayed with the girls while I went to check on Alice. Before leaving, John leaned in and whispered, my mates at the station would love a shot with Nicola. When I saw Alice again, she looked much better. The doctor told me she could go home, as long as someone stayed with her for the night. Alice mentioned she needed fresh clothes, so I took the girls home to help me gather some things for her. On the way back, Nicola asked if I could drop her off at her flat. I welcomed the opportunity to talk more. As we pulled up, she smiled and said, nice car. I'd love to drive it sometime. We can definitely arrange that, I replied with a grin. Before she got out, she slipped me a piece of paper with her number. Call me, she whispered. Back at the hospital, I delivered Alice's clothes, assured the doctor I'd stay with her for the next 24 hours, and then brought her home. She spent the afternoon playing with the girls while I made lunch, though I knew the real conversation wouldn't happen until the girls were in bed. Later that night, Alice joined me on the sofa, a glass of wine in her hand. She tucked her legs beneath her and sighed. I've been such a fool, she admitted. I stayed quiet, letting her speak. He never wanted to marry me, she continued bitterly. He just needed me to cover his lies. You were supposed to fight the adoption, so he could make it seem like it was all your fault. How did you find out? I asked. His wife came to see me, Alice said, her voice shaking. She told me he never filed for divorce, and he never would. His whole career depends on staying married. She knew about his affairs, but decided to step in because I wasn't just a fling. She broke down, sobbing in my arms. You'll be okay, I reassured her. You just need some rest. The next morning, I made breakfast while the girls excitedly watched me cook. Over breakfast, I suggested a trip to Spain or Portugal, and the girls were thrilled by the idea. Alice, however, was skeptical. You know we can't just take off like that, she said. I'd need time off work. Talk to your doctor, I suggested. He'll sign you off for a couple of weeks. You can even take it as holiday if you want. Her eyebrows shot up, but I continued. I've already booked a Mediterranean cruise for next week. You can take the girls. At first, Alice was angry, accusing me of trying to force her into sharing a cabin with me. But when I clarified that I wasn't going, she softened and hugged me, grateful for the gesture. Later that evening, after spending a wonderful day with the girls, I returned home and called Nicola. We made plans to meet at a pub later that night. Nicola was direct, confident, and I found myself genuinely looking forward to our time together. When she arrived at the pub, she looked stunning. As we sat down, she got straight to the point. I've heard a lot of different stories about you, Jack, she said. I've seen the good side, but I need to know about the bad. I knew I had to be honest. Taking a deep breath, I began telling her everything. I thought Alice was cheating on me, I started. I found a video on an adult site and was convinced it was her. It broke me. I hated her, and in my anger, I did something terrible. Later, I found out the woman in the video wasn't Alice. It was her twin sister, someone I didn't even know existed. But by then, I had already done something I couldn't take back. I paused, the weight of what I was saying settling in. Nicola stayed silent, listening intently. I threw Alice out of the house, and I did it far too forcefully. I'll never forgive myself for that. But in court, she stood up for me, telling the judge I needed help, not prison. I spent over a year in therapy, working through my issues with a counselor named John. Eventually, he told me I didn't need the sessions anymore. Nicola's expression softened, but I could tell she still needed to know more. And then there was Kelly, I continued. I got involved with her after Alice, only to find out she was married. I confronted her husband, not violently, but I didn't handle it well. Since then, I've been trying to keep my life together. Anger is still something I battle with, but I'm working on it. Nicola's eyes were watery. So when you ask who the real Jack Carter is, I said, my voice heavy with emotion, the answer is both. I'm not proud of who I was, but I'm doing everything I can to be a better man. The Jack sitting here now wouldn't react like that again. I've learned to separate anger from hatred. Nicola reached across the table and took my hands in hers. She stood up, kissed me softly on the forehead, and walked away. For a moment, I thought that was it. But she wasn't leaving. She was just headed to the restroom. When she returned, she smiled and said, "I could use another drink," signaling that she was willing to give me a second chance. We stayed at the pub until closing time, and I drove her home. As we sat quietly in the car outside her flat, I finally asked, "Can I see you again?" She smiled softly. "Yes. Pick me up tomorrow night." We kissed before she left, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt a sense of peace. A few days later, I drove Alice and the girls to Falmouth for their Mediterranean cruise. Emily promised to email me every day, and as they boarded, Alice gave me a tight hug. "Thank you," she said softly. I watched them sail off, feeling content that they were happy and enjoying life. While they were gone, Nicola and I grew closer, spending nearly every evening together. On Friday night, she finally invited me to her place after dinner. That night wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a connection I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, I arrived late to work for the first time since my divorce, and Mason couldn't resist teasing me about it. Meanwhile, Emily's emails from the cruise were a delight to read. Nicola enjoyed hearing about their adventures as much as I did. Despite her evening shifts, we made time for each other, often meeting for lunch during the week. Business was also progressing well. I placed a bid for a dealership in Bishop Stanton, which kept me busy during the day. At some point, I stopped by to visit Sarah and told her about Nicola. Sarah seemed genuinely happy for me, saying, "You deserve this. It's about time." That Saturday, I picked up Alice and the girls from their cruise. Grace excitedly recounted their adventures, while Emily playfully teased, "I think the ship's captain might have a crush on Mom." Once we got back to Alice's house, she thanked me again and even hinted that she wished I had come along on the cruise with them. Later that evening, Nicola showed up at my door, visibly shaken. She told me about a fatal car accident involving a stolen vehicle she had been pursuing. I held her as she cried, and we spent the night together, comforting each other. The next morning, I gave her a key to my house, letting her know she could come over any time she needed to. Later that day, I stopped by to see Alice and asked her how her first day back at work had gone. She seemed distant and mentioned hearing rumors that Miles had died in a car accident. I asked how she felt about it, but she wasn't sure. Overhearing our conversation, Emily blurted out, "I hope he's dead." Alice quickly reprimanded her, but I wasn't sure what Alice truly felt about the news. There was something in the air, an unspoken shift between us. That evening, we all had dinner together as a family. It was nice, and Alice made an effort to make me feel welcome. She asked about my business, and I mentioned that I was planning to open a second branch of drive-in auto services. "What happened to J&G Auto Services?" she asked. "Doesn't it make you sad to let it go?" J&G had stood for Julie and Greg, a symbol of our past together. I shrugged. "Not really. You gave up your share of the company when you traded it for my half of the house." "At the time, my share of the house was worth more," she pointed out. "True," I replied. "And I couldn't afford the mortgage then, so it worked out for both of us." "Well," she said, a little wistfully, "it's just sad to see another connection between us disappear." At the end of the evening, I headed home, sensing that she wanted me to stay a little longer. The next day, the inquest into Miles's death was held, and Alice asked me to go with her. The police ruled it an accident. Miles had likely fallen asleep at the wheel. There were no skid marks, and his car had coasted into a tree. The coroner questioned whether it might have been suicide, but the evidence didn't support that theory. The pathologist mentioned some unusual trauma, but nothing that changed the police's conclusion. Miles had alcohol in his system, which made it more likely that he had simply fallen asleep. During a break, I approached Miles's widow. "Would you consider selling the wreck?" I asked. She looked surprised but took my card. "Why?" she asked, still confused. "I was thinking of restoring it," I said. "You will not," she snapped, her tone icy. "I never want to see that car again." Alice overheard the exchange, and we both chuckled at the widow's reaction. After the inquest, Alice went to the restroom, and Miles's widow approached me again, hinting at having dinner together. Disgusted, I declined, but she didn't miss a beat, still suggesting we meet. When Alice returned, I introduced them. Yes, but I know her as Alice Baker, the widow said coldly. Caught off guard, Alice explained that she used her maiden name at work. Then she turned to the widow with sarcasm in her voice. You lied in court about being a devoted wife when Miles was with you for years, wasn't he? The widow smirked. When £500,000 is on the line, lying gets easier. If they suspected suicide, the insurance wouldn't pay out, and we both know Miles only cared about himself. Alice was fuming, but the widow handed me her card, smiling slyly. Think about my offer. After she left, Alice muttered, she gets $1 million, and I get nothing after 6 years with him. Her words surprised me. Had she always been so focused on money? And what did she mean by 6 years? We'd been divorced for 5, so something didn't add up. The next day, I drove Alice back to work, and we had lunch with one of her colleagues, Allison. As we chatted, Allison made a comment about how I was supporting Alice after her affairs with Miles. The word affairs stuck with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. As I reflected on everything, I started piecing it together. Something about Alice's timeline and behavior hadn't felt right for a long time.